By the late 1700s, many battles had been fought with the slaves and with American Indians who were constantly being pushed off of their lands, and there was also trouble between the colonists. Many of these battles, revolts, and rebellions took place before the Revolutionary War and writing of the Constitution of the United States of America. The Revolutionary War, fought from 1775 to 1783, waged by the American colonies against Britain, influenced political ideas and influence. This small fledgling nation won its freedom from the greatest military force of its time. Skirmishes between British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord in April 1775 kicked off the armed conflict, and by the following summer, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. France entered the American Revolution on the side of the colonists in 1778, which added the French and their American Indian allies, together with the black and the white colonist. However, before the addition of the French, this had essentially been a civil war. However, it turned into an international conflict. After French assistance helped the Continental Army force the British surrender at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. The Americans had effectively won their independence, though fighting did not formally end until 1783. Americans claimed to be fighting for their freedom. However, they didn't want freedom for all. The American and British governments passed several laws that helped foster the decline of indentures. The UK Parliament's Passenger Vessels Act 1803 regulated travel conditions aboard ships to make transportation more expensive and to hinder landlords' tenants seeking a better life. An American law passed in 1833 abolished the imprisonment of debtors. After 1776, the American colonies began buying and selling more Negroes. It is not true that you can say whatever you want on YouTube as long as it is the truth. This isn't true for America, so why then would it be true for YouTube? If you want to learn more about America history information that you may not see in any video, get my book, Amid the Twisted History, An American Negro Story, by Keisha M. Alexander. The Federalist Papers are a collection of 85 essays written in the late 1780s during the Revolutionary War as America was fighting for her freedom and independence. These papers, written and authored by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, collectively under the name of Publius. These essays argued in support of the proposed U.S. Constitution and aimed to persuade voters to support its ratification. The Constitution of the United States of America was ratified after the Revolutionary War. These 85 essays were used in drafting the freedoms of the citizens of the United States. The Three-Fifth Compromise was written into the original Constitution. These writings explain the Three-Fifth Compromise. It does not mean what we think, nor is it what I was told by Black history lectures when I was a child. I knew that the Civil War was fought for freedom in America. I just didn't understand how so many atrocities could happen to a people that are free and citizens of this great freedom land. In my book, I give the understanding of the Three-Fifth Compromise as stated by those who drafted the writings that would be used to draft our great Constitution of the United States of America. From my book Amid the Twisted History, page 100. Federalist number 54. But we must deny the fact that slaves are merely just property, and in no respect whatsoever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws, in some respect as persons, and in other respect as property. In being compelled to labor not for himself, but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty, and chastised in his body, by the capricious will another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human ranks and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. In being protected, on the other hand, in his life and in his limbs, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of our society, not as part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of the slaves, when it views them in the mixed character of persons and property. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the law in which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criterion, because it is under the pretext that the law has transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. This definition is what allowed the slave-holding states to have a powerful political standing because they could count 3/5 of all other persons. The South was gaining political power because they could count their slaves as part of American society. The Negroes were already a part of American society. The word Indian is used instead of Negro in our Constitution because that is who they truly are. All that was needed was for Congress to end slavery and give the Negroes/Indian back their full status as persons and no longer both persons and property. Southern plantation owners didn't want their lucrative business to end. This was not just their livelihood. Free labor made them rich, along with their children and, at times, their children's children. Slavery made the Negro in America very poor along with their children and their children's children. America was in turmoil after the Revolutionary War. The colonies needed to establish rules and laws that would govern the new independent United States of America. The Constitution with Bill of Rights gave protections and freedoms to the citizens of the colonies of America. However, those protections were not transferred to the Negro inhabitants of America until after the writing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those rights are still in question today. Why are Negroes still fighting for their rights in America? The condition of the Negroes in America is a direct result of the transfer of their rights to immigrants. But why these particular people? That is, and has always been the question. The Emancipation Proclamation was written during the Civil War to give freedom to Negroes in the states that was in rebellion against the United States. Proclamation 95. Regarding the status of slaves in states engaged in rebellion against the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation, officially Proclamation 95, was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by United States President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, during the American Civil War. The proclamation had the effect of changing the legal status of millions of enslaved Negro Americans in the secessionist Confederate States from enslaved to free. As soon as slaves escaped the control of their enslavers, either by fleeing to Union lines or through the advance of federal troops, they were permanently free. In addition, the proclamation allowed for former slaves to be received into the armed service of the United States. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. It stated, "I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do order and designate as the states and parts of states, wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be free. Such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." The Emancipation Proclamation outraged white Southerners and their sympathizers, who saw it as the beginning of a race war. It energized abolitionists and undermined those Europeans who wanted to intervene to help the Confederacy. The proclamation lifted the spirits of Negro Americans, both free and enslaved. It encouraged many to escape from slavery and flee toward Union lines, where many joined the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation became a historic document because it would redefine the Civil War, turning it for the North from a struggle solely to preserve the Union to one focused on ending slavery. This act by President Lincoln set a decisive course for how the nation would be reshaped after that historic conflict. In 1863, after the signing of this Emancipation Proclamation held no sway over the Confederate States, The Civil War waged on in America for another 2 years before the 13th Amendment was passed in Congress in January of 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States. Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. After the writing passing of the 13th Amendment and the addition of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, which also explains that the Negro American was a part of American society during slavery, calling them 3/5, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, just 4 months after he and his allies ended slavery in the United States. Many things were happening around America, including suppression and oppression of the Negro American rights and privileges. The rights of the Negro Americans are still being denied by the writing of states' acts, codes, laws, and ordinances. The Constitution had become the highest law in the land. No state law can supersede the Constitution and federal law. However, every state, including the northern states, began the practice of writing acts, laws, and codes to deny the Negro Americans their rights as constitutional citizens of the United States. How the Black Codes limited Negro American progress after the Civil War. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws effectively continued enslavement for Negro Americans by restricting their rights and exploiting their labor. When slavery ended in the United States, freedom still eluded Negro Americans who were contending with the repressive set of laws known as the Black Codes. Widely enacted throughout the South following the Civil War, a period called Reconstruction, these laws both limited the rights of Black people and exploited them as a labor source. In fact, life after bondage didn't differ much from life during bondage for the Negro Americans subjected to the Black Codes. This was by design, as slavery had been a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and the former Confederate states sought a way to continue this system of subjugation. They may have lost the war, but they're not going to lose power civically and socially, says M. Keith Claybrook, Jr., an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at California State University, Long Beach. So, the Black Codes were an attempt to restrict and limit freedom. Losing the Civil War meant the South had little choice but to recognize the Reconstruction-era policies that abolished slavery. By using a law, they would deny Negro Americans the opportunities and privileges that white people enjoyed. However, the one-time Confederacy could keep these newly liberated Americans in virtual bondage. A loophole in the 13th Amendment. White planters in these states denied Black people the chance to rent or buy land and paid them a pittance. The 1865 ratification of the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude in all circumstances, except as a punishment for crime. This loophole resulted in Southern states passing the Black Codes to criminalize activities that would make it easy to imprison Negro Americans and effectively force them into servitude once more. First enacted in 1865 in states such as South Carolina and Mississippi, the Black Codes varied slightly from place to place, but were generally very similar. They prohibited loitering, vagrancy, Claybrook says. The idea was that if you're going to be free, you should be working. If you had 3 or 4 Black people standing around talking, they were actually vagrant and could be convicted of a crime and sent to jail. Essentially criminalizing the situations that the state legislatures created to trap them back into a position of servitude. In addition to criminalizing joblessness for Negro Americans, the codes required Black people to sign annual labor contracts that ensured they received the lowest pay possible for their work. The codes contained anti-enticement measures to prevent prospective employers from paying Black workers higher wages than their current employers paid them. Failing to sign a labor contract could result in the offender being arrested, sentenced to unpaid labor, or fined. Fees were the easiest way to reinstitute servitude, as Negro Americans earned so little that paying a steep fine was out of the question for most of them. Failure to pay fines allowed the state to order them to work off their balances, a system called debt peonage. Typically, this work was agricultural in nature, just as Black Americans had performed while enslaved. Negro children were not spared from forced labor. If their parents were seen to be unfit or weren't around, the state received these children as orphans, and they would be put into apprenticeships, almost identical to the Virginia slave law for Negro women and children. They were slaves if their mother was a slave. The Black Codes not only forced Negro Americans to work for free, but also essentially placed them under surveillance. Their comings and goings, meetings, and church services were all monitored by the authorities and local officials. Black people needed passes and white sponsors to move from place to place or to leave town. Collectively, these regulations codified a permanent underclass status for African Americans. After the Black Codes had been enacted throughout the South in 1865, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to give Negro Americans more rights, to a degree. This legislation allowed Black people to rent or own property, enter contracts, and bring cases before courts. Moreover, it allowed individuals who infringed upon their rights to be sued. This Act of 1866 did not change the condition of the newly freed Negro Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, 14 Stat 27-30, enacted April 9, 1866, reenacted 1870, was the first United States federal law to define citizenship and affirm that all citizens are equally protected by the law. It was mainly intended, in the wake of the American Civil War, to protect the civil rights of persons of African descent born in or brought to the United States. The act was passed by Congress in 1866 and vetoed by U.S. President Andrew Johnson. In April 1866, Congress again passed the bill to support the 13th Amendment, and Johnson again vetoed it, but a two-thirds majority in each chamber overrode the veto to allow it to become law without presidential signature. John Bingham and other congressmen argued that Congress did not yet have sufficient constitutional power to enact this law. Following passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, Congress ratified the 1866 Act in 1870. The act had three primary objectives for the integration of Negro Americans into the American society following the Civil War. 1. A definition of American citizenship. 2. The rights which come with the citizenship. And 3. The unlawfulness to deprive any person of citizenship rights on the basis of race, color, or prior condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. The act accomplished these three primary objectives. Why they would have to include color and previous condition of servitude is because there were those Black Americans who had not been slaves in America. They were already free Black American citizens. Some of these Black Americans were very wealthy and in high standing in American society. If you had no proof of who you are and someone to vouch for you, these other Black people could be mistaken for Negroes and be treated accordingly. This is probably the reason why most of them resided in the North and referred to themselves as Moors or African American. The author of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was United States Senator Lyman Trumbull. Congressman James F. Wilson summarized what he considered to be the purpose of the act as follows when he introduced the legislation in the House of Representatives. Here is where the confusion started. Now it seems that Americans need to know what a citizen is. No one had a problem understanding what a citizen was before the acts and laws to free the Negro came into the picture. It was very clear that everyone who was not the Negro slave were citizens. Now they need to define citizenship, because on one seems to know what a citizen is when it came to Negro rights. He states, it provides for the equality of citizens of the United States in the enjoyment of civil rights and immunities. What do these terms mean? Do they mean that in all things civil, social, political, all citizens, without distinction of race or color, shall be equal? By no means can they be so construed. Do they mean that all citizens shall vote in the several states? No, for suffrage is a political right which has been left under the control of the several states, subject to the action of Congress only when it becomes necessary to enforce the guarantee of a republican form of government. Nor do they mean that all citizens shall sit on the juries, or that their children shall attend the same schools. The definition given to the term civil rights in Bouvier's Law Dictionary is very concise and is supported by the best authority. It is this: civil rights are those which have no relation to the establishment, support, or management of government. President Johnson and his allies were trying to reverse the Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendments. All Americans up to that point was protected under the laws of the colonies. Everyone, indentured servants, black or white, were protected under the law of the colonies as citizens. No debate as to what a citizen really is. The Southern American aristocracy did not want to let go of the slavery that they had become so accustomed to. During the subsequent legislative process, the following key provision was deleted. There shall be no discrimination in civil rights or immunities among the inhabitants of any state or territory of the United States on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. John Bingham was an influential supporter of this deletion, on the grounds that courts might construe the term civil rights more broadly than people like Wilson intended. Weeks later, Senator Trumbull described the bill's intended scope. This bill in no manner interferes with the municipal regulations of any state which protect all alike in their rights of person and property. It could have no operation in Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, or most of the states of the Union. On April 5, 1866, the Senate overrode President Andrew Johnson's veto. This marked the first time that the U.S. Congress ever overrode a presidential veto for a major piece of legislation. With an incipit of an act to protect all persons in the United States in their civil rights and furnish the means of their vindication, the act declared that all people born in the United States who are not subject to any foreign power are entitled to be citizens, without regard to race, color, or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. A similar provision, called the Citizenship Clause, was written a few months later into the proposed 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 also said that any citizen has the same right that a white citizen has to make and enforce contracts, sue and be sued, give evidence in court and inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. Additionally, the Act guaranteed to all citizens the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, as is enjoyed by white citizens, and, like punishment, pains, and penalties. Persons who denied these rights on account of race or previous enslavement were guilty of a misdemeanor and, upon conviction, faced a fine not exceeding $1,000, or imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or both. The Freedmen's Bureau was established as a part of Reconstruction in the South to help the newly freed Negro American integrate into American society as free people. When indentured servants were released from their indenture, they were always given something to begin their life as American citizens. The newly freed Negro Americans were not given anything at all. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, usually referred to as simply the Freedmen's Bureau, was a U.S. government agency of early post-American Civil War Reconstruction, assisting freedmen, i.e. former slaves, in the South. It was established on March 3, 1865, and operated briefly as a federal agency after the war, from 1865 to November 1872, to direct provisions, clothing, and fuel for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. In 1863, the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission was established. 2 years later, as a result of the inquiry, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill was passed, which established the Freedmen's Bureau as initiated by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. It was intended to last for 1 year after the end of the Civil War. The Bureau became a part of the United States Department of War, as Congress provided no funding for the Bureau to operate. The War Department was the only agency with funds the Freedmen's Bureau could use and which had an existing presence in the South. Headed by the Union Army General Oliver O. Howard, the Bureau started operations in 1865. From the beginning, its representatives found its tasks very difficult, in part because Southern legislatures passed black codes that restricted movement, conditions of labor, and other civil rights of African Americans, nearly replicating the conditions of slavery. Also, the Freedmen's Bureau only controlled a limited amount of arable land. The Bureau's powers were expanded to help African Americans find family members from whom they had become separated during the war. It arranged to teach them to read and write, skills considered critical by the freedmen themselves as well as by the government. Bureau agents also served as legal advocates for African Americans in both state and federal courts, mostly in cases dealing with family issues. The Bureau encouraged former major planters to rebuild their plantations and pay wages to their previously enslaved workers. It kept an eye on the contracts between the newly free laborers and planters, given that few freedmen had yet gained adequate reading skills, and pushed whites and blacks to work together in a free labor market as employers and employees, rather than as masters and slaves. In 1866, Congress renewed the charter for the Bureau. President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had succeeded to the office following Lincoln's assassination in 1865, vetoed the bill, arguing that the Bureau encroached on states' rights, relied inappropriately on the military in peacetime, gave blacks help that those poor whites had never had. Poor whites did not endure almost 400 years of slavery in America, Johnson stating that helping them would ultimately prevent freed slaves from becoming self-sufficient by rendering them dependent on public assistance. Remember earlier in the video I spoke about all of the different amenities that came after your indenture was over. Both whites and blacks received something to start their life. Why didn't the handout given to the indentured servants when they finished their indenture make them become dependent on the governments? There is always a double standard when it comes to the rights of Negro Americans. Negroes have yet to receive anything from this country that is not also given to everybody else, including those who are newly arriving to the United States. Somebody has to be the permanent underclass, and when you look around the world, in almost every society, the Aboriginal or indigenous people of those lands are the permanent underclass, so it is for the Negro in America. Though the 39th United States Congress, controlled by radical Republicans, overrode Johnson's veto, by 1869 Southern Democrats in Congress had deprived the Bureau of most of its funding, and as a result it had to cut much of its staff. By 1870 the Bureau had been weakened further due to the rise of Ku Klux Klan (KKK) violence across the South. Members of the KKK and other terrorist organizations attacked both blacks and sympathetic white Republicans, including teachers. Northern Democrats also opposed the Bureau's work, painting it as a program that would make African Americans lazy. Americans were not as was willing to help the Negro in America, and all who did was terrorized, mistreated, and looked down upon. The arguments, the fights, the wars, all have been fought to bring freedom and equality to the Negro in America. American land and resources were being taken, while the millions of indigenous people suffer under the weight of constant oppressive devices designed by the very institutions that are supposed to protect them and their rights. The 14th Amendment, Amendment 14, to the United States Constitution was adopted on July 9, 1868, as one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Usually considered one of the most consequential amendments, it addresses citizenship rights and equal protection under the law and was proposed in response to issues related to formerly enslaved Americans following the American Civil War. The amendment was bitterly contested, particularly by the states of the defeated Confederacy, which were required to ratify it to regain representation in Congress. Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. However, every state in the Union did break the law by denying the Negro Americans their constitutional rights. From the year 1662, at the writing of the Negro Child Slave Law, that essentially made all Negro American slaves, until 1868 with the writing of the 14th Amendment. It took Congress over 200 years and 5 ratified laws to release these people and their children from permanent slavery, only for that right to be transferred to everyone in the world, except the people for whom these were written. The turmoil that Americans faced to end slavery in America was not to bring freedom to everyone in the world, it was to be freedom to Americans, the Negro Americans. Abridgment or denial of those civil rights by private persons is not addressed by this amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court held in Civil Rights Cases 1883 that the amendment was limited to state action and, therefore, did not authorize the Congress to outlaw racial discrimination by private individuals or organizations. This is why racial discrimination still exists in America, because of these Supreme Court justices who interprets the law in a way that benefits them and whomever is paying them to do it. Citizenship of the United States is a legal status that entails Americans with specific rights, duties, protections, and benefits in the United States. It serves as a foundation of fundamental rights derived from and protected by the Constitution and laws of the United States, such as freedom of expression, due process, the rights to vote, live and work in the United States, and to receive federal assistance. Why didn't any state, local government, or institution support the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments for over 100 years? To this day, the rights of the indigenous people of America, aka Negroes, are being violated, trampled, and blatantly unrecognized. American colonists, along with the many immigrants that were allowed to come here from Europe between 1851 to 1900, continued to be allowed to violate the Constitution when it came to the 14th Amendment citizens. If every one of your rights is violated, and no one, not the government, not the Supreme Court, not the law or the states, would stand up for the Constitution as the supreme law in this land. These actions taken against the Constitutional Republic of America say to me that there is no law in America that can't be broken if the money is right. It also says to me that if the Negro is not free, then no one in America is free. If the Negro do not have constitutionality, neither does anyone else. This was the fear of our founders, that if European Americans did not allow freedom to come to this country, the European Americans would be establishing slavery for their children and their children's children. If you are fighting really hard to keep something, don't be surprised when you get exactly what you fought so hard for, and America has fought to keep slavery alive and well. Quotes by Abraham Lincoln. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. Quote. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. Quote, I am not a know-nothing. That is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it. All men are created equal, except Negroes. Quote, when the know-nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal, except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I shall prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty.